All right. I wanted to give you a little bit of discussion concerning Chapter 4, Greece, Humanism, and the Speculative Leap, which was during the era 3000 BCE to 332 BCE. In this time, we had what was known as the Bronze Age, or the Aegean Age, because of the Aegean Sea, aka the Mediterranean Sea. The civilizations that arose out of this time period, the early time period, were namely the Minoan culture, which is centered on the island of Crete and considered a precursor to the Greeks. In the ancient Minoan culture, there was linear A and linear B writing. Linear A was basically undecipherable, and linear B is decipherable. In the Mycenaean civilization, they had fortified cities on the Greek mainland, and they were traditional enemies of Troy. But also emerging in this time period, about 1000 BCE to 750 BCE, was the Heroic Age. And the reason it was called the Heroic Age was this era treated the issue of heroic themes in poetry and literature. And in this heroic age, we have the heroic works of Homer, which dealt, of course, with heroes, men of renown, namely the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, Homer was born sometime around 800 BC and is often hailed as one of the greatest poets of Western literature. The Iliad is an important piece of Greek history, if not for its value that it comprises one of the most valuable collections of papyrus, Greek manuscripts that we have. In fact, in the entire range of ancient Greek and Latin literature, the Iliad ranks next to the New Testament in possessing the greatest amount of manuscript testimony. In 1955, a gentleman by the name of Hans Joachim Mette listed about 450 papyri of the Iliad. And this is in comparison to several thousand that we have of the New Testament. Of course, the Iliad predating the New Testament by quite some time. Homer's Iliad is about a typical human military venture, the Trojan War, that began at the height of the glory that was the Mycenae in Greece, the Bronze Age, later remembered as the Golden Age. Now, the Golden Age is the term used to denote the historical period in ancient Greece lasting roughly from the end of the Persian Wars in 448 BC to either the death of Pericles in 429 BC or the end of the Peloponnesian War in 404 BC. Pericles was an Athenian general, politician, and orator. The hero of the epic in the Iliad was Achilles, who was a military hero who exemplified bravery. He despises deception and dies in defense of his honor. And so it's kind of this epic tale, but it is a poem that Homer wrote. And the Iliad and the Odyssey were actually written in what we would call heroic verse, which is generally associated with the meter or rhythm of epic poetry in Greek and Latin, also known as dactylic hexameter. And hexa means six, like a hexagon, and it pertains to the amount of syllables used in the verse. There are very few English examples of this kind of meter, but one example we do have, just to give you a perspective, comes from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who wrote a poem called Evangeline. And it goes as follows. This is the forest primeval, the murmuring pines of the hemlocks, bearded with moss, and in garments green, indistinct in the twilight. Now that may not jump out at you as something particular concerning the amount of syllables in the verse and all of that, but it is in fact very much so written in the same dactylic hexameter. One thing that Homer's works consistently dealt with was the gods of the Greek mythology. Now there were 12 gods, sometimes 13, in the pantheon. And all these gods were believed to live on top of Mount Olympus. Now, the primary gods of the Greek pantheon of classical Greece are Aphrodite, Apollo, Ares, Artemis, Demeter, Hades, Hephaestus, Hera, Hermes, Aestia, Poseidon, and Zeus. Now, the reason I said 12 or 13 is because technically Hades does not dwell on Mount Olympus, so sometimes, depending on who is doing the counting, they might leave Hades off the list. But ultimately, Zeus and Hera were the two main gods, kind of a mother and father supreme couple, so to speak, except if you study Greek mythology, you'll find that Zeus was quite promiscuous. One instance that comes to mind is his affair he has with Mnemosyne, who was a goddess of memory, and he transforms himself into a giant bird and essentially rapes her, and their affair producing the Muses. Anyway, so Zeus was not exactly a very faithful part of that relationship with Hera. So although Greek popular religion produced no sacred scriptures or doctrines, the oracle at Delphi became very famous throughout the region. In fact, we see the oracle at Delphi kind of bleeding into later Christian texts in Acts chapter 16. If you're familiar with that, the Apostle Paul casts a spirit out of a young girl who was mocking them, who was said to be an oracle of Delphi. So in this time, what was emerging was also the polis, which was the city-state. And so that word polis you may recognize if you've ever heard the word metropolis, which basically means city, city-state to be exact. And the polis was an independent city and its surrounding region, and it was all under a unified government. And a polis might originate from the natural divisions of mountains and sea, from local, tribal, and cult divisions as well. So sometimes geographical things would influence how a polis or city-state would be developed. And usually the town was walled and contained like a citadel on raised ground, which we would call an acropolis, and a marketplace, an agora. Government was centered in the town, and usually there was an assembly of citizens, a council, and magistrates. And at the time there were known to be about 200 of these existing in this era. So a lot of what we know about history coming out of the Greek culture at the time we can attribute to Herodotus, who was actually is hailed as the first historian. Herodotus was born in the first half of the 5th century BC in the Greek city of Halicarnassus, which was on the edge of the Persian Empire. Now, he traveled extensively. He collected information from people that he met about themselves and about their ancestors, and he was able to talk to many who had experienced the events themselves, or he had heard firsthand accounts from others who were involved. And the Persian wars at the time were the first wars for which there exists a detailed historical narrative written by somebody who was able to obtain detailed and reliable information. And so we give this credit of essentially being the first historian to Herodotus. And so in this time period in Athens in the Greek Golden Age, we see a major shift from what we would call oligarchy to democracy. And an oligarchy is a form of power structure that effectively everything rests on the elite class or the distinguished by royalty, wealth, family ties, commercial, military legitimacy. And so like the rich of the rich, the top class, the high end runs the society. And the converse of that, what it becomes, which is what we would argue is probably the more effective and more appealing, since we too are a democratic society, would be a democracy, which is a form of government which all eligible citizens participate equally. Now, this name that came up earlier, Pericles, is important to take a second to reflect on him, because Pericles, In 430 BC, after the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, which was a war between Athens and Sparta, Pericles gives this speech to the Athenian assembly, and he states in this speech that basically that Athens is the greatest name in history, and it's the greatest power that has ever yet arisen, and a power to be remembered forever. And so he glorifies Athens in such a provocative way that essentially this irritates Sparta significantly, and ultimately Sparta wins in the end. Also emerging this time, we have to also talk about the Olympic Games and their significance. Now, the first Olympic Games were held in 776 BC in ancient Greece. Now, these games were important because they weren't just about athletics. They were actually athletic games and festivals that were held in order to worship the gods. And so you can't really think about you can't really consider the Olympic Games unless you consider the fact that these were kind of a form of worship to the gods. I mean, again, earlier we mentioned that the pantheon of gods, except for Hades, all live on Mount Olympus, and here we call this the Olympic Games. That should be an indication this has to do with the gods. So we had a lot of really amazing things that were emerging in the time, issues that helped us understand literature, the works of Homer, our understanding of Greek mythology and all the gods and goddesses at the time. Political understanding emerged. The first historian coming out of this era. Then you've got the shift between the oligarchy to the democracy. And we see this glorification of Athens as being celebrated as this amazing hub of cultural and philosophical and humanities influence in the world. And you can't really discuss the humanities or the Greeks without, of course, talking a little bit about Greek theater. And so the number of surviving plays from the ancient age of Greek theater is only approximately 45, but based on what a lot of these authors would say about works they had written and other records, we know there are far more that were produced in the time period, but we only have 45. And there were among this Greek theater movement some great tragedians, as we call them. And these three great tragedians are Aeschylus, it's kind of hard to say his name, Sophocles, and Euripides. Now, Aeschylus was a Greek dramatist, and he lived somewhere around 525 to 456 BC. And he's called the creator of the art of tragedy in Western tradition. And so if tragedy typically dealt with really dramatic plays, it's kind of redundant to say, but where everybody dies in the end. And he was a creator of this art of tragedy, some say. And Sophocles was also a tragedian. He wrote Ajax, maybe you've heard of Antigone. He also wrote The Women of Trachis, Oedipus the King, Electra, Philoctetes, and Oedipus at Colonus. And so those are the works of Sophocles. And then you have Euripides, who was the youngest of these three principal 5th century tragic poets. And then, of course, we have Aristophanes, whose best known work was Frogs. And so this would be a good example of the important Greek theater artists that came out of this time period. Now, you can't talk about the Greeks unless, of course, you talk about philosophy. Now, philosophy is a very vast subject, to say the least. But it essentially comes from the Greek word philos, which is to love, and sophos, which is wisdom. So it's the love of wisdom. And so essentially these philosophers sit around and think, and they ask questions, and they try to solve the world issues and try to understand ethics and the way things work and why things are the way they are. And so among these mentionable philosophers, we have the natural naturalist philosophers, which would be the pre-Socratics. We have Thales of Miletus. Some of these words I'm trying to say myself, but and we have the beginnings of Western science and philosophy with Thales. And he said in the 6th century, he was one of the first to pose the question, basically, what are the basic building blocks of the universe? I mean, what is it? There was always an attempt to try to have a philosophy of everything. Like what is like the one question to ask that solves and answers all the problems and questions of the universe, which is a pretty lofty thing to try to achieve. But he asked that question: what is the basic building block of the universe? So that's a pretty important question to ask. And then you have Heraclitus, who is the first Western philosopher to go beyond physical theory in search of a metaphysical foundation and moral applications. Then you have Leucippus, who was the founder of atomism. And atomism is this concept that the universe is comprised of these physical, like quote-unquote atoms, these parts, and everything is comprised of these different components. And I know that's not really very clear, but it is a little bit confusing. And then you have Democritus, who expanded the atomic theory of Leucippus. And then we have Pythagoras, which you've probably all heard of the Pythagorean theorem, which is really interesting because Pythagoras didn't actually write anything himself, but much is attributed to him. So he was not only, he didn't only deal with philosophy, but he also dealt with science and mathematics. And one thing that he did argue for that kind of helps us understand in this naturalist philosophical sense was that he argued that there are 3 kinds of men. And just as there are 3 classes of strangers who come to the Olympic Games, the lowest consists of those who come to buy and sell, and next above them are those who come to compete. Best of all are those who simply come to look on. Men may be classified accordingly as lovers of wisdom, which again is philosophy, interestingly, lovers of honor, and lovers of gain. And so, very interesting contribution to philosophy there. And then you have the Hippocrates, which is where we get the Hippocratic Oath, which is an ethical oath that doctors take, to do no harm. That's where we get the term, because Hippocrates was also a physician. And in the writings of the Corpus Hippocraticum, he provides a wealth of information on biomedical methodology, and he offers one of the first reflective codes of professional ethics. And so those would be our naturalist philosophers, pre-Socratic, meaning before Socrates. And then you have humanist philosophies. And so the humanist philosophy embodies the sophists. Now the sophists were interesting because they were itinerant professional teachers and intellectuals who frequented Athens and other Greek cities in the second half of the 5th century BCE. In return for a fee, these sophists offered young, wealthy Greek men an education in what they would call arete, or virtue or excellence. Thereby, they would attain wealth and fame, while also, of course, arousing some significant antipathy. So people didn't always like them, but their job essentially was to go and teach people philosophy, and very humanistic in their approach. And then we have Socrates and the quest for virtue. Socrates was born in 469 BC. His father was a stonemason and his mother was a midwife. And he later on in his life, he gives an interesting connection to his mother in saying that his profession, he characterized himself as kind of a midwife who helped give birth to truth. So Socrates is a really interesting guy. And out of the Socratic philosophies, we see what becomes called the dialectical method. And this is really when philosophy began to form this kind of question-answer method. And it's an art of practicing and arriving at truth by the exchange of logical arguments. And so you state your position, and someone says, if what you're saying is true, then this must be true. What do you say about that? And then you go back and forth until essentially you try to disprove the logic of somebody's argument philosophically. Plato is also important because Plato was a student of Socrates. And so a lot of his dialogue, a lot of his conversation that he wrote, things he wrote, his philosophical works, were conversations that he had with Socrates. And so he was born about 427 and 428 BC. There was some discrepancy. If you ever hear me say there was a time that it was this, or maybe it was that, maybe this year or that year, it's because they're maybe not absolutely sure. And a lot of times with ancient history, you might be off a year for whatever reason. But Plato wrote what is called the Crito. And it's a dialogue by Plato, a conversation that he has with Socrates and his wealthy friend Crito. And the whole conversation is regarding justice and injustice and the appropriate response to injustice. So it's an interesting contribution to Western thought. And then Plato also developed what we call the theory of forms. Now, the theory of forms was, here's the problem that the theory was attempting to solve. Maybe I can explain what that is. There's an ethical problem, okay? And so Plato's theory of forms is an attempt to answer this ethical problem. And the problem is, how can humans live a fulfilling, happy life in a contingent, changing world where everything they teach themselves, attach themselves to, can be taken away? The problem of permanence and change is also another aspect of this problem. So how can the world appear to be both permanent and changing? The world we perceive through the senses seems to always be changing. The world that we perceive through the mind using our concepts seems to be permanent and unchanging, which is most real, and why does it appear both ways? Is it the thoughts in the mind or the real world? So the general structure of the solution that Plato is attempting to offer with his theory of forms, Plato splits up existence into two realms, the material realm and the transcendent realm of forms. Plato also wrote the Republic, which is pretty popular. You've probably heard that phrase, Plato's Republic. And Plato's strategy in the Republic was to first explicate the primary notion of societal or political justice, and then to derive an analogous concept of individual justice. So, part of society deals heavily with concepts of justice and injustice, and you have to have politics and societal norms in order to control these things. And so Plato's work on the Republic did attempt to do exactly that, to give a concept of justice. Aristotle was a student of Plato, probably one of my favorite philosophers, and he lived 384 to 322 BC. Now he wrote a lot. Some of the works of Aristotle are metaphysics, logic, physics, psychology, ethics, politics, poetics, and rhetoric. Attributed to Aristotle is this empirical method. In the study of any subject, this is a method that Aristotle implemented. He would collect, analyze, and group all relevant facts in order to determine their meaning in relations with each other. And this gave him a systematic and factually correct basis from which to generalize about underlying rules or principles. And so it was very, very important that he was one of the first to take on that kind of thinking and problem solving. However, the medieval period didn't really run with Aristotle's concept, but then later, as we did develop the scientific method, we see kind of a revival of this empirical method. The science of logic, which Aristotle's logic, can be summed up basically in one word called syllogism. And you've maybe seen some of these, but this was the way his logic flowed. This is the way that he would argue all logic works in this manner. And believe it or not, the syllogism, the science of logic that Aristotle developed, has unparalleled influence on the history of Western thought. And so an example of a syllogism that Aristotle his science of logic would present would be to say all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. And so you would see the first statement, all men are mortal, as A, Socrates is a man, as B, and Socrates is mortal as C. Another example would be all men are mortal, all Greeks are men, all Greeks are mortal. And so essentially this syllogism is saying this, and you can take doesn't matter what the phrases are, the content of the syllogism is, but you can break it down into A, B, and C, and you can say it this way, and it will always be true depending on certain requirements of the statements themselves. But if all B is A and all C is B, then all C is A. The golden mean is also attributed to Aristotle, and this is important because if you've ever heard anybody say the moderation of all things, and they attribute that to Aristotle, it's kind of not one extreme or the other, but what is the middle state between? And that was a lot of Aristotle's philosophy would not be the extreme left or the extreme right, but the moderate view. What's in the middle? What would be a way to approach this problem or this question, or how would we act in the world ethically? One example would be concerning virtues. If you are too courageous, which is a virtue, and you are too extreme in your courage, it could be harmful. And that would be an example of the golden mean. And the nature of virtue, essentially, according to Aristotelian philosophy, is that happiness is the end of all our pursuits. And that's the nature of virtue. Like, whatever you do, it should produce the most happiness in your life, and other people's, arguably. And that's an intrinsic desire that we all have, to do what benefits the most. And that would be the nature of Aristotelian virtue.